Riding on the cloud, shining like the sun, at the trumpet call, so lift your head.
The word joy shows up time and time again throughout Scripture. We see it very strongly used in the book of Psalms. David uses it over and over again. We see it through the New Testament in places like Galatians chapter 5, where Paul talks about how joy is a fruit of the Spirit. Now, oftentimes in this life, in our world, in our society, in our circle of friends, or in our little circle we call life, it's often, or it can be often, difficult to have and to sustain the joy that every Christian should have. Now, we've talked about that in the last few spiritual thoughts. We've talked about joy and how to have that joy and ways that we can express that joy. Joy is something that we as Christians have been reborn to have. John chapter 3, when Jesus was talking to Nicodemus, he talks about being born again. And even though that has to do, yes, with baptism, we also need to remember what being born again is. It's not just being baptized, it's more than that. It's the life that you are now being called to live. And a part of that life is being able to have and to experience and to share with others the joy that comes from the Lord. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, it talks about how we've been born again to a living hope. And a part of that living hope, a part of that, living a new life is understanding and experiencing and sharing the joy that is now ours, the joy that belonged to the Lord that is now ours. And so remember, this joy that we're discussing isn't based on circumstances. It isn't based on situations or particular moments. Instead, it's based on who we are. It's based on who we belong to. It's based on what Jesus has done for us. It's based on the fact that we possess something that is from God Himself. Joy is something that is described. It's something that God has. It's something that God has given to us. It is something that is a part of His kingdom. And again, He graciously gives that to us. Sometimes, though, it may seem difficult to feel a consistent spiritual joy, if you will. Again, we live in this world of things that are unplanned. We live in this world where things are unpredictable. Bad things happen. So many things here just in 2020 have been happening. And you turn on the news or you turn on social media and you start reading all of these reports, and you don't know who to trust. You don't know what to believe. You kind of really sometimes get bogged down in all the information and misinformation, and you get bogged down emotionally, and it causes us really to get bogged down spiritually. We get frustrated. We get angry. We get agitated because, again, so many things are going on and we don't know what to believe and what to think. And so the joy that we're supposed to have doesn't come as easily. And in fact, it becomes difficult to have and difficult to share with others. However, the task, though, I want to remind us, does get easier when we do realize that, no matter what I see, no matter what I hear, no matter what goes on in my life, I have the power, Ryan has the power, you have the power to govern what comes into your mind and your heart and what goes out of your mind and out of your heart. You have the power to govern what you think. Okay, so we can't think that we're hopeless and helpless in the situation. We have the power to help govern what goes in to our hearts and minds. But what happens when we lose that joy, though? What happens when we aren't governing as we should and we allow things to slow down that joy that comes from the Lord? Well, let me give you three things real quick that I hope will help you get that joy back that maybe is losing in your life or is struggling in your life. Number two, remember that only God can restore the joy in your life. So David said in Psalm 51:12, he says, "Restore to me the joy of your salvation." Of course, he's talking to God, but restore to me the joy of your salvation. Now, we have to keep this verse in context. And in the context, David has just repented of sin. He has just laid out his life and his sins and the bad things, the mistakes that he has done. He has laid them out before God with the point of receiving forgiveness and the removal of sin from his life. And so because of that, David is already anticipating the joy that comes from being delivered from sin, the joy that comes from the salvation that God offers, the joy of being back in a relationship with him. Listen, the joy that only comes from God can only be restored by God. Okay, you cannot find a restored joy away from God. You cannot find a restored joy to God from somewhere else, from something else. It can only come from God. Now, when we're saved, I want you to understand where this sense of joy comes from. When you're saved, do you remember the feeling that you had when you come up out of those waters of baptism? You want to tell everybody about it. You feel like you were a brand new person. Well, over time that fades. Over time we get spiritually lazy, spiritually apathetic. We get selfish with our own lives. And so in order to have that joy again in our life, that feeling of being saved, that feeling of I'm so excited about what's happened in my life, and I'm excited about what lives in me now and what I'm a part of, we have to get rid of those unnecessary things that take up the space in our heart and beg God to replace it with his joy. So again, we too can pray or can say what David has said here: restore to me the joy of your salvation, because there is joy in being saved from God. Number two, remember the good that has been done in your life. So I want to read what Paul said in Philippians chapter 1, verses 3, 4, and 5. He says, I thank my God for you every time I think of you, and every time I pray for you all, I pray with joy because of the way in which you have helped me in the work of the gospel from the very first day up until now. When you think about the church, when you think about those that have prayed for you, when you think about those that have cried with you and that have put their arm around you when you needed it the most, when you lost that loved one, or you got maybe a diagnosis of you or a family member that wasn't favorable in your life, or maybe they laughed with you and they congratulated you when you made that promotion, or they congratulated your kids when maybe they have done something great at school or in sports or in some extracurricular activity. They were there to support them and watch them. When you think about the way that the church and those positive Christian role models have been in your life, that brings us joy. That brings a sense of joy to our life. Christians should bring joy to our lives. They should remind us that we're not alone in this fight. They should remind us that we're not alone in this world, that we're not alone in this race. Often we have to be careful not to focus on the unkind things people do, even the unkind things Christians do. Now, we always need to remember that Christians are people. We're human. We often make mistakes, and we often say things and do things that we shouldn't. So we shouldn't focus on that, though. We need to focus more on the positive things, not the bad things. And so I would encourage you to, don't contribute negativity to this world. Don't contribute negative words or negative thoughts to this world, but instead contribute things that are going to build up the people around you, build up the world around you. And as always, don't ever forget to thank God for putting those positive people in your life, for putting the church in your life to help you in a time of need. And number three, when you lose your joy, you need to learn to trust God again. So David in Psalm 40 and verse 4 says, the joys of those who trust in the Lord, who have no confidence in the proud or in those who worship idols. Again, one of the reasons we lose joy is because we forget about God. And I'm not talking about we forget completely about God, but we forget about some of the things that God has done for us. We forget to trust God, and that's because we began to trust things around us and trust people in our life more than we trust God. We think our problems are too big for God. We think situations are too big for God, that He can't handle them, and so we try to do it on our own, or we try to put trust in someone else, or maybe programs or leaders. And what you're often going to find, though, I guess the more you live, the more you learn. But programs, leaders, even Christians, even people, they're going to let you down at one time or another. And that's sometimes what causes us to lose trust in God, is because we equate God with people. What we need to remember is God is not like other people. God is vastly different. Words cannot describe how much different God is from us. But God loves you more than you can even begin to imagine. A God so powerful that we cannot even begin to comprehend the power that he has. The God who created all, the God who gave you the very breath of life, the God has promised to help us. Help us through anything in life if we put our trust in him. So I want you to ask yourself today, do I have the joy of the Lord living in me and through me? And if you really can't answer that question, then maybe you need to sit down and do some praying and do some reflecting on what's happened in your life to cause you to lose that joy. And I would say, get rid of those things in your life. Replace those things in your life with the joy of the Lord. And maybe, and just maybe, you'll be able to restore what you lost. But again, remember, only God can do that. So learn to trust him. Remember the good people in your life that have been there for you. Lean upon them. And always remember that only God can restore the God-given joy in your life. Thank you all.
Behold, he riding on the cloud, shining like the sun,